What is the one question that every successful person avoids answering honestly? Nathan Reed asked as he slowly set down his glass of sparkling water. The private dining room fell silent almost immediately. 23 floors above Manhattan, beneath warm chandeliers and overlooking the lights of the city, some of the most accomplished people in America exchanged uncertain glances. Around the table sat technology founders, hedge fund managers, best-selling authors, university professors, and executives whose decisions moved millions of dollars every day. Nathan Reed had invited them all to an exclusive dinner. Officially, it was a networking event. Unofficially, everyone knew Nathan enjoyed intellectual challenges. The billionaire had built a reputation for asking questions that sounded simple but were almost impossible to answer. He was famous for it. Podcast hosts had tried. Business leaders had tried. Television interviewers had tried. Most failed. Nathan glanced around the room and smiled. "Come on," he said. "Surely someone here has an answer." A venture capitalist spoke first. He offered a thoughtful explanation about risk and ambition. Nathan listened politely, then shook his head. "Interesting. But no." A professor followed with a detailed answer involving psychology and decision-making. Nathan considered it for several seconds. "Closer," he said. Still nodded. Another guest tried. Then another. 15 minutes passed. The atmosphere shifted from confidence to frustration. People who were used to being the smartest person in the room suddenly found themselves searching for words. Nathan remained patient. The question had followed him for nearly a decade. He had asked it in private meetings and public interviews. Hundreds of intelligent people had attempted to answer it. None had satisfied him. Near the far end of the room, Emily Carter quietly refilled water glasses. She moved carefully between tables, nearly invisible to the guests. That was normal. Most people noticed the conversation. Very few noticed the waitress. Emily preferred it that way. She carried a silver pitcher in one hand and a tray in the other. Her blonde hair was tied neatly back. Her uniform was simple and professional. Nothing about her appearance suggested she belonged in discussions about leadership, philosophy, or success. Nathan asked the question again. What is the one question every successful person avoids answering honestly? Another executive attempted an answer. Nathan shook his head. A best-selling author tried next. Same result. Soft laughter spread around the table. Not because the question was funny, because nobody seemed capable of solving it. Emily continued working quietly. Yet something about the question held her attention. She had heard versions of it before. Not from billionaires. From books, lectures, conversations. The room grew quieter. Nathan leaned back in his chair and checked his watch. "I am starting to think nobody has it," he said. Several guests smiled awkwardly. One man joked that Nathan probably did not know the answer himself. More laughter followed. Nathan smiled. "I know the answer." Then he looked around the room. "I just have not heard anyone else say it." Emily paused beside the table. Only for a moment. Nathan noticed. Most people would not have. But Nathan had spent years studying reactions. The smallest hesitation often revealed the most interesting thoughts. "You look like you disagree," he said. The room turned instantly. 20 pairs of eyes focused on Emily. She froze. The silver pitcher felt unexpectedly heavy in her hand. A few guests smiled politely. Others looked amused. Nathan remained calm. "Curious. Do you have an answer?" he asked. Emily looked around the room, then back at the billionaire. For a second, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Finally, she took a quiet breath and said, "I think I might." The room remained completely still. Even the soft music playing through hidden speakers seemed to fade into the background. Emily immediately wished she could take the words back. Not because she lacked confidence in her answer. Because 20 strangers were staring at her as if she had just walked onto a stage she never intended to enter. A few guests exchanged amused glances. One executive smiled into his glass. Another leaned toward the person beside him and whispered something that caused a quiet chuckle. Nathan noticed every reaction. He had seen this pattern before. The moment someone unexpected entered an intellectual conversation, people often judged the speaker before hearing the idea. Emily set the silver pitcher carefully onto the table. Her movements remained calm, professional, controlled. She had spent years learning not to react when people underestimated her. Across the room, a professor folded his arms. A venture capitalist raised an eyebrow. The best-selling author smiled politely. The expression was kind, but it carried an assumption. The assumption that this would be entertaining rather than insightful. Nathan remained focused on Emily. You think you have an answer? He asked. Emily nodded once. I do. More smiles appeared around the table. Not cruel. Not hostile. Simply skeptical. Nathan leaned forward slightly. Then I would like to hear it. Emily hesitated. Not because she was searching for words. Because she understood the weight of the moment. The question itself was not difficult. The difficult part was answering it honestly. Most people answered questions about success using ideas they wanted others to admire. Very few answered using uncomfortable truth. She looked around the room. Expensive watches reflected chandelier light. Tailored suits. Designer dresses. People accustomed to being listened to. Then she looked back at Nathan. The question every successful person avoids answering honestly, she said quietly, is whether they would still choose the same life if nobody admired the result. The room became silent. Completely silent. No laughter. No whispers. No movement. Nathan's expression did not change. Yet something behind his eyes shifted. Emily continued before doubt could interrupt her. Most people talk about money, achievement, recognition, freedom, but those are outcomes. She paused. The real question is whether the sacrifices were worth it when nobody is watching. Nobody spoke. The executive who had smiled earlier slowly lowered his glass. The professor stared at the table. Nathan remained motionless. For several seconds, he simply looked at Emily. Then he asked a question nobody expected. And what answer do most successful people give? Emily almost smiled. They never answer it directly. A few guests shifted in their seats. The observation felt uncomfortably accurate. Nathan nodded slowly. Why? Emily glanced toward the city lights beyond the windows. Because the honest answer changes over time. Nathan said nothing. Emily continued. A person might achieve everything they dreamed of. Wealth, status, influence. Then one day realize they miss things they can never get back. Time, relationships, moments. The room listened carefully now. Not because she spoke loudly. Because she spoke calmly. Without trying to impress anyone. Nathan studied her face. For the first time all evening, he was not evaluating the answer. He was evaluating the person giving it. And what surprised him most was not the intelligence behind her words. It was the absence of ego. Most people treated difficult questions as opportunities to display knowledge. Emily treated them as opportunities to search for truth. Nathan slowly smiled. Not a polite smile. A genuine one. Then he asked, would you mind if I asked a second question? Emily looked at Nathan for a moment before nodding. The attention in the room felt heavier now. Earlier, people had listened out of curiosity. Now they listened because they genuinely wanted to hear what happened next. Nathan folded his hands on the table. The smile remained on his face, but there was more focus behind it now. More intention. All right, he said. Here is the second question. The room grew quiet again. Even the waitstaff in the background seemed to slow down. Nathan glanced briefly around the table before returning his attention to Emily. What is the most dangerous belief a leader can have? Several guests immediately reacted. Some smiled as if they already knew the answer. Others nodded confidently. One executive opened his mouth to speak. Nathan raised a hand. Not this time. His eyes remained on Emily. I would like her answer first. A few surprised looks appeared around the room. Emily felt them immediately. She understood what they were thinking. Why her? Why not one of the CEOs? Why not the professor? Why not the billionaire? Himself? She understood because she had spent years watching similar assumptions form inside people's minds. She took a slow breath. The question itself was not difficult. The difficult part was choosing the most honest answer. The most dangerous belief a leader can have, she said quietly, is believing they are the smartest person in the room. Several guests laughed softly. Nathan did not. He simply watched her. Emily continued. Not because intelligence is bad. Because certainty is. The laughter disappeared. The moment someone believes they already know enough, they stop learning. The moment they stop learning, they stop seeing. Nathan leaned back slightly. Stop seeing what? Emily answered immediately. Reality. The room fell silent again. A hedge fund manager lowered his eyes. A technology founder crossed his arms and listened more carefully. Nathan rested one elbow on the table. Explain. Emily nodded. People rise because they solve problems. Then success convinces them they understand everything. Eventually, they begin trusting their assumptions more than the evidence in front of them. She paused. That is when mistakes become invisible. Nathan stared at her. Something about the answer seemed to strike deeper than the first one. Emily noticed it. Not because his expression changed dramatically, because it barely changed at all. People revealed themselves most clearly in small moments. Interesting, Nathan said. So you believe success creates blindness? Emily shook her head. No. Nathan raised an eyebrow. Then what creates blindness? Emily glanced around the table. Pride. Nobody laughed this time. Nobody whispered. Nobody reached for a drink. The room had become completely engaged. Nathan slowly smiled. You answer quickly. Emily looked down for a second before meeting his gaze again. Only because I have spent a long time thinking about questions like these. A professor sitting near the center of the table finally spoke. Most people spend years studying leadership and still struggle to answer that clearly. Emily smiled politely. Studying and thinking are not always the same thing. Several heads turned toward her. Not because the statement sounded arrogant. It did not. It sounded true. Nathan looked toward the city lights beyond the windows. Then back at Emily. For the first time all evening, he seemed less interested in testing her and more interested in understanding her. Around the room, people who had initially smiled at the waitress were now studying her with genuine curiosity. And somewhere beneath the warm chandelier light and the distant glow of Manhattan, Nathan realized something unexpected. The second answer had not made him question Emily. It had made him question himself. Nathan remained silent for several moments after Emily finished speaking. Around the table, people waited for him to respond. Normally, this was the part of the evening where he challenged an answer. He enjoyed pushing ideas further, pulling apart assumptions, looking for weaknesses in arguments. Yet this time felt different. Emily's answers were not polished speeches. They were observations. Simple, direct, difficult to dismiss. Nathan slowly smiled. All right, he said. Let us make this more interesting. A few guests straightened in their chairs immediately. They recognized that tone. Nathan only used it when he was about to raise the difficulty. Emily remained standing beside the table, calm as ever. Nathan studied her for a second before speaking again. I have a question that has cost companies billions of dollars. Several guests exchanged curious looks. Nathan continued. Every failed company eventually asks it. Every successful company should ask it much earlier. He paused. What is the most expensive mistake an organization can make? The room became quiet. This was different now. The questions were no longer philosophical. They were practical, real, the kind of question that determined careers and fortunes. Emily thought for a moment. Not because she did not know, because several answers could be correct. Nathan watched carefully. He noticed that unlike many executives, she was not rushing to speak. She was thinking. There was a difference. Finally, Emily answered, believing that success proves future success. A few people frowned. Nathan tilted his head slightly. Explain. Emily nodded. The biggest mistakes rarely happen during failure. Several people looked surprised. They happen after success. Nathan leaned forward. Emily continued. Failure makes people cautious. Success makes people comfortable. The room listened closely. When an organization succeeds, people start protecting what worked yesterday instead of preparing for tomorrow. A technology founder slowly lowered his fork. A professor nodded almost unconsciously. Emily continued. The market changes. Customers change. Technology changes. But successful organizations often assume the formula that brought them here will take them further. She paused. Eventually, reality changes faster than they do. Nathan smiled slightly. And that costs billions? Emily nodded. Sometimes much more. Nobody interrupted. Nobody laughed. Earlier in the evening, people had questioned whether she belonged in the conversation. Now they were taking mental notes. Nathan noticed it immediately. The atmosphere had changed. Emily was no longer viewed as the waitress who happened to answer one question correctly. She had become the most interesting person in the room. Nathan glanced toward one of the hedge fund managers. What do you think? The man smiled. I think I wish she worked for my company. Soft laughter spread around the table. This time the laughter carried admiration rather than skepticism. Emily smiled politely, but said nothing. Nathan noticed that too. Most people became more confident after receiving praise. Emily seemed almost uncomfortable with it. That intrigued him. He turned back toward her. So if success is dangerous, he asked, what protects people from it? Emily answered almost immediately. Curiosity. Nathan raised an eyebrow. Not intelligence? Emily shook her head. Intelligence finds answers. She paused. Curiosity keeps asking questions after the answers arrive. The room fell quiet again. Somewhere beyond the windows, Manhattan shimmered beneath thousands of lights. Inside the private dining room, nobody seemed interested in dinner anymore. The food remained untouched. Conversations had stopped. Even people who normally dominated discussions were listening. Nathan looked at Emily carefully. The evening had started with him asking questions. Yet for the first time in years, he felt as though he was learning more from the answers than from the questions themselves. And something told him the most difficult question of the night had not been asked yet. Nathan looked around the table as the silence settled deeper than before. The energy in the room had shifted completely from curiosity to full attention. Nobody was eating. Nobody was checking their phones. Even the staff moving quietly in the background seemed careful not to interrupt. Nathan leaned back in his chair, studying Emily as if she had become the center of a problem he had not fully solved yet. Then he spoke again. His voice was calmer now, but more precise. "One more question," he said. A few guests exchanged glances. They could feel something different about this moment. Earlier questions had been intellectual games. This one felt more personal. Nathan continued. "If you were in my position, leading companies, making decisions that affect thousands of people, what would you focus on first?" The room grew quiet again. This question was no longer abstract. It was directed, practical, leadership-focused. Emily understood that immediately. She did not answer right away. She looked down at the table for a moment, then slowly back up at Nathan. "I would focus on people," she said. A few guests nodded instinctively. The answer sounded simple. Expected. Nathan did not react. He waited. Emily continued. "Not as a concept. Not as a resource. As individuals." The room became still again. Emily explained calmly. "Most organizations focus on systems first. Processes, efficiency, structure. Those matter. But they forget that every system is only as strong as the people operating inside it." Nathan watched her carefully. There was no hesitation in her voice. No attempt to impress. Just clarity. Emily continued. "When people are not understood, systems eventually fail. When people are supported, systems evolve naturally." A hedge fund manager leaned back slightly, thinking. A technology executive crossed his arms, but kept listening. Nathan finally spoke. "That sounds ideal. But not always practical." Emily nodded. "It is not always easy, but it is always necessary." That answer caused a different kind of silence. Not disbelief. Reflection. Nathan slowly tapped his finger on the table. "Most leaders would start with strategy," he said. Emily replied immediately. "Strategy changes. People carry it." Nathan studied her again. The way she answered was consistent. Grounded. She did not speak like someone repeating theories. She spoke like someone who had observed consequences firsthand. Nathan asked another question. "What makes people ignore that?" Emily took a breath. "Speed," she said. A few eyebrows raised. She continued. "When decisions need to be made quickly, leaders often default to what is measurable. Numbers, metrics, results." She paused. "People are harder to measure, so they are easier to overlook." Nathan nodded slowly. That part resonated with him more than he expected. Emily continued. "But the most important outcomes in business are always tied to people. Retention, innovation, trust. None of those can be fully captured in spreadsheets." The room remained silent. Even the earlier skepticism had disappeared completely. Nathan looked around briefly. The same people who had smiled when Emily first spoke were now listening without interruption. That realization seemed to register with him as well. He turned back toward her. "You think most leaders miss that?" Emily shook her head slightly. "I think most leaders know it. They just forget it under pressure." Nathan smiled faintly. "That is a dangerous distinction." Emily agreed quietly. "Yes." Another pause settled over the table. Outside, Manhattan lights shimmered through the tall windows. Inside, the atmosphere felt completely different from when the evening began. Nathan leaned forward again, resting his forearms on the table. His voice softened slightly. "Emily," he said, "why do you think you can answer these questions so easily?" The room shifted slightly. This felt like the real question. Emily hesitated for the first time, not because she lacked an answer, but because she understood what he was truly asking now. And for the first time that evening, Nathan was not testing her intelligence. He was trying to understand her story. Nathan's question hung in the air longer than any before it. The room had grown completely silent. No one attempted to interrupt. Even the soft ambient sound of the city beyond the glass seemed distant. Emily slowly lifted her gaze from the table and met Nathan's eyes. For the first time since the conversation began, her expression changed slightly. Not uncertainty, but recognition that the question had shifted from ideas to identity. Nathan remained still, waiting. He was no longer testing her answers. He was testing her foundation. Emily took a slow breath. When she spoke, her voice remained calm, but there was a quieter weight to it. "I do not think I answer easily," she said. A few guests leaned in slightly. Nathan did not move. Emily continued, "I think I answer because I have had to think about these things in a different way than most people in this room." A pause followed. The statement was simple, but it changed the tone. Nathan's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in focus. Emily glanced briefly toward the window, where the lights of Manhattan stretched endlessly. "Most people discuss success from a distance," she said. "I have experienced what it costs." The room reacted subtly. No one spoke, but the atmosphere tightened with attention. Nathan asked quietly, "What do you mean by that?" Emily hesitated for a moment. This was the first time she had considered stopping the flow of the conversation. But something about Nathan's tone made her continue. She returned her gaze to him. "I was studying economics and philosophy at university," she said. A few guests exchanged surprised looks. Nathan remained focused. Emily continued, "I was on track for graduate research. I was offered opportunities that I never expected to have." The room listened more closely now. "Then my family situation changed," she said. Her voice did not break, but it softened. "My father became seriously ill. I had to make a decision between continuing my academic path or becoming the primary support for my family." A quiet shift moved through the table. Several guests lowered their eyes slightly, as if the story had turned more personal than expected. Emily continued, "I chose my family." Nathan nodded slowly, but said nothing. Emily added, "After that, life becomes different. You do not stop thinking. You just start thinking in smaller moments between responsibilities." A faint silence followed. Nathan finally spoke again. "And that is where these answers come from." Emily nodded. "Yes." A hedge fund manager at the table leaned forward slightly. "So you are saying experience gave you perspective?" Emily shook her head gently. "I am saying necessity forced attention." That line settled over the room more heavily than the others. Nathan exhaled slowly, as if absorbing it. For the first time, he looked away from Emily and toward the table itself. Then he spoke, but his voice was quieter than before. "Most people in this room have experience," he said. "But not everyone has this kind of perspective." Emily did not respond. She did not need to. Nathan looked back at her again. "Do you regret it?" he asked. The question changed everything. It was no longer about intelligence. It was about life. Emily paused for a longer moment this time. The room waited with her. Then she answered simply, "I do not regret choosing my family." A few seconds passed. Then Nathan nodded slowly. Something in his expression softened. Not sympathy, understanding. Around the table, the guests remained silent, no longer as observers of a strange exchange, but as participants in something far more human than they expected when the evening began. Nathan remained quiet for a long moment after Emily's last answer. The atmosphere in the private dining room had changed completely from what it had been at the start of the evening. The energy of challenge and curiosity had softened into something more reflective. People were no longer trying to compete with the conversation. They were absorbing it. Nathan finally leaned back in his chair, his gaze still fixed on Emily. There was something different in the way he looked at her now. It was no longer the curiosity of a man testing intelligence. It was the recognition of someone trying to understand a life experience that did not fit his expectations. Emily stood calmly beside the table, her hands relaxed at her sides. She was no longer simply the waitress serving water and coffee. That identity had faded in the minds of everyone in the room, even if only temporarily. Nathan spoke quietly. "You have answered every question I have asked tonight in a way I did not expect." A few guests nodded subtly. Emily did not respond immediately. She simply waited. Nathan continued. "Most people I meet try to impress me. They try to sound intelligent. They try to sound correct." He paused. "You did none of that." Emily gave a small, almost unnoticeable nod. "I was not trying to impress anyone," she said. Nathan studied her closely. "That is exactly why it worked." A faint, thoughtful silence followed. Then Nathan shifted slightly forward in his seat. The tone in his voice changed again, becoming more direct. "I want to ask you something else," he said. The room subtly adjusted again, sensing the importance of what was coming next. Emily met his gaze. "Go ahead." Nathan looked at her for a moment longer before speaking. "Have you ever considered what your life would look like if you had never stepped away from your academic path?" The question settled over the table. It was no longer about philosophy or leadership. It was personal. Emily lowered her eyes briefly. This question was not unfamiliar to her. She had asked it of herself many times in quiet moments. But hearing it from someone like Nathan Reed gave it a different weight. She answered carefully. "Yes," she said. "I have thought about it." Nathan waited. Emily continued. "There are versions of life where I finished my degree, where I pursued research, where I worked in places like this room instead of serving in it." A few guests shifted slightly in their seats. The contrast was clear in her words, but she spoke without regret in her tone. "But those versions are not the ones I lived," she added. Nathan nodded slowly. "Do you think you lost something?" Emily paused again. The room felt completely still now. Even the faint clinking of glassware had stopped. "I do not think in terms of losing or gaining," she said quietly. "I think in terms of responsibility." Nathan tilted his head slightly. "Explain." Emily met his gaze again. "At that time, someone needed me more than my future needed me," she said. "So I chose what was immediate." The simplicity of her answer carried more weight than any elaborate explanation could have. Nathan looked down briefly at the table, as if processing her words in silence. When he looked back up, his expression had softened again. "And if you were given the opportunity to return to that path now?" he asked. Emily did not answer immediately, not because she was uncertain, but because she understood that the question itself assumed something she did not fully accept. Finally, she said, "I do not think life offers returns, only new directions." Nathan held her gaze for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. Not the smile of a man who had won an intellectual exchange, but of someone who had just encountered a perspective he could not easily dismiss. Around the room, no one spoke, because at that moment, it was clear that the conversation had moved far beyond questions and answers. It had become something else entirely. Nathan remained seated long after the room had fallen into complete silence. The conversation had not ended, but it had clearly shifted into something more reflective, something no one wanted to interrupt. Guests no longer checked their phones or spoke in whispers. Even the staff had slowed their movements as if sensing the weight of what had unfolded. Emily stood quietly beside the table, her posture steady, her attention calm, though she could feel the continued focus of everyone in the room. Nathan finally broke the silence, but his voice was no longer sharp or testing. It was measured, almost thoughtful. "I want to show you something," he said. A few guests exchanged subtle glances. Nathan rarely shifted a conversation like this without purpose. He reached into his jacket and placed a small tablet on the table. He tapped it once, and a document appeared on the screen. Emily looked at it without moving closer. Nathan noticed. "You do not need to come closer," he said. The room leaned in instead. On the screen was a series of notes, questions, and recorded responses from various meetings over the past several years. Emily scanned the visible portion from where she stood. Nathan spoke again. "Every time I meet someone who claims to understand leadership, I ask them questions similar to the ones I asked tonight." He paused. "Most answers are predictable. Some are impressive. Very few are memorable." He looked up at Emily. "Yours were memorable." Emily did not respond. Nathan continued. "But there is something else I noticed." The room grew even quieter. "You do not answer like someone trying to be correct," he said. "You answer like someone who has lived through the consequences of the question itself." Emily's expression remained steady, but her eyes shifted slightly downward for a moment. Nathan observed that carefully. He then said, "That is rare." A hedge fund manager at the table finally spoke. "Mr. Reed, are you saying she is different from the others you have tested?" Nathan did not look away from Emily when he answered. "Yes." The single word carried more weight than any explanation. The room reacted subtly, not with surprise anymore, but with realization. Emily finally spoke. "I was not aware I was being tested," she said calmly. Nathan nodded. That is usually when the most honest answers appear. A faint, almost respectful silence followed. Nathan then leaned slightly forward again. "There is something else I want to understand," he said. Emily waited. Nathan continued. If you are capable of seeing these patterns so clearly, why are you working outside of environments where that ability is recognized? The question was direct, but not judgmental. It was genuine curiosity. Emily looked down for a moment. This was the question she had expected at some point in her life. Not from strangers at a dinner table, but from herself during long nights. She answered carefully. Because recognition is not always aligned with necessity, she said. Nathan frowned slightly, not in disagreement, but in thought. Emily continued. When I left my academic path, I did not stop thinking. I just stopped doing it in environments that rewarded it. She paused. Life did not stop requiring decisions. It simply required different ones. Nathan studied her again. The simplicity of her explanation contrasted with the depth of its implication. Around the table, several guests were no longer watching as observers. They were listening as if something important was being revealed about how intelligence actually exists outside of formal systems. Nathan slowly closed the tablet and set it aside. You are aware, he said quietly, that most people in this room would have already tried to turn your insight into an advantage. Emily met his gaze. I am aware, she replied. Nathan nodded once. And you are not interested in that. Emily gave a small shake of her head. Not in this moment. Another silence settled. This one different from before. It was no longer about questions or answers. It was about understanding something that could not easily be categorized. Nathan leaned back slightly, looking at Emily as if recalculating an entire framework he had used for years. And for the first time that evening, the billionaire was no longer asking questions to test someone else. He was asking questions to understand what he had just discovered. The room remained silent for several seconds after Nathan closed the tablet. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the distant city noise behind the glass seemed less present, as if the entire space had narrowed down to the small group of people sitting around the table and the waitress standing quietly beside it. Emily did not speak either. She simply waited, as she always had, for the moment to pass naturally. Nathan looked at her for a long time without saying anything. For the first time that evening, he was not evaluating answers. He was evaluating impact. Finally, he spoke, but his voice was quieter than before. I did not expect tonight to become this, he said. A few guests shifted slightly in their seats. Nathan continued, still looking at Emily. I invited people here to challenge ideas. I did not expect to be challenged by perspective. Emily remained calm. Perspective is often invisible until it is not, she said simply. A few people around the table exchanged thoughtful glances. Nathan nodded slowly. That is exactly the problem, he said. Most people only recognize value when it fits within a familiar structure. He paused. You do not fit any of the structures I usually rely on. Emily did not respond immediately. Then she said, structures are useful until they become limits. That line landed differently. Even those who had been skeptical earlier were now listening without resistance. Nathan exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. Do you realize what just happened here? He asked. Emily shook her head slightly. I answered some questions. Nathan smiled faintly. You changed the tone of this entire room. A subtle reaction moved through the guests. It was true, even if no one had said it out loud. The evening had begun as a challenge. It had become something else entirely. Nathan looked around the table once more, then back at Emily. Most people I meet spend their lives trying to be seen, he said. You seem to have spent yours learning to see. Emily looked down briefly, then back up. I do not think I learned it, she said. I think I had no choice but to notice it. Nathan nodded slowly. That answer seemed to stay with him longer than the others. A long silence followed. No one rushed to fill it. The food on the table remained untouched. The conversation had moved too far from dinner to return to anything ordinary. Nathan finally stood from his chair. The movement drew attention instantly. He walked a few steps away from the table, looking out at the Manhattan skyline through the glass wall. Then he turned back toward Emily. I want to make you an offer, he said. The room reacted subtly. Some guests leaned forward. Others stayed still. Emily did not move. Nathan continued. Not because you answered my questions correctly. Not because you impressed anyone here. He paused. Because you think in a way that most organizations spend years trying to develop. Emily looked at him carefully. Nathan added, and because I believe ignoring that would be a mistake. A quiet tension filled the room again. Emily did not respond immediately. She was not surprised by the offer, but she understood its weight. Nathan waited patiently, showing no pressure. Around the table, people watched this moment with a kind of silent awareness that something significant had shifted. Finally, Emily spoke. "What kind of offer?" she asked. Nathan turned back toward her fully. "A position where your thinking is not overlooked," he said. "Where your perspective is not treated as an exception." Emily looked down at the table for a brief moment. Then she met his gaze again. The room waited for her response. Nathan did not add anything. He simply watched. And for the first time since the question had been asked at the beginning of the evening, the answer was no longer the most important part of the conversation. The decision was.